Stephen. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting on over 900 stations on Pacifica and NPR and low-power FM and college and community radio stations on public access TV and PBS TV stations and both TV satellite networks, Dish Network Channel 9415, Free Speech TV, 9410 Link TV, and on Direct TV Channel 375 and also 348. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Our headlines are also available in Spanish for any radio station to take. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Today we're doing a special on the power of the drug industry, the most powerful industry, the largest defrauder of the federal government. We'll talk about that at the end of the broadcast. Right now we're looking at a drug test that was done in Nigeria on 200 Nigerian children. 11 died, a number were maimed. The drug test was conducted by the Pfizer Corporation. We're joined by Joe Stevens, Washington Post reporter in the offices of the Washington Post in Washington, and Musikila Mojid, a Nigerian journalist who's based here in New York. Juan?
Yeah, Joe Stevens, I'd like to ask you about what the requirements are in terms of both the U.S. government and foreign governments on these tests, because as you've outlined in what you told us before the break, it's since been proven that they were backdating information, providing fraudulent documentation. This documentation obviously went over the mail, so conceivably even the U.S. government could go after Pfizer for participating in basically fraudulent, for wire fraud, information that they were going back and forth between the United States and Nigeria. But what about the Nigerian government? What did they know before Pfizer went in on these on this trial?
Well, Pfizer says they got full approval going in. There's not a lot of evidence of that, and the Nigerian government says that now that's not the case. And we've talked to a lot of people who think that Pfizer did not get approval and that they were coming in quickly. There was a record meningitis epidemic, and Pfizer thought this would also give them a halo effect over their drug by using it in a humanitarian fashion. Doctors Without Borders, who was operating in the hospital, saw it differently and thought they were operating humanely, and Pfizer perhaps was not. But there's very few controls around the world. The U.S. government can't control what goes on in Nigeria. At best, they can control what the results of the drug trials are used for back in the U.S., because this clearly was a trial that would have impacted the approval of the drug in the U.S. And by the way, the drug was ultimately approved. It was never approved for use by children in the U.S. or Europe. But then it was associated with liver toxicity and taken off the market. It's not used at all in Europe anymore, and only in very rare cases in the U.S. But it's very hard for the U.S. to legislate what happens overseas. And when you're in a state which doesn't operate smoothly, a failing state, there are very few controls, so you're left at the mercy of the local officials in place at the time. And Nigeria is a very complicated country, and at the time in northern Nigeria also, the federal government had limited control of that region. It's obviously a country which ranks near the bottom in various corruption indices. There's been allegations of money changing hands before this WikiLeaks allegation. So it's very, very difficult to police.
Musikila Mojid, you have followed this story for your newspaper Next. Can you talk about what the effect of the exposure of this trial by Pfizer had in Nigeria? And the story of how Pfizer tried to smear the Attorney General who was trying to bring these issues up?
Yeah, Nigerians are clearly outraged by this revelation that Pfizer hired investigators to smear the Attorney General, to blackmail him to drop the federal charges. But not a lot of people are entirely surprised in Nigeria, because before the WikiLeaks cable came out, our newspaper, Next, had exposed the mysterious disappearance of the federal charges against Pfizer. You know, suddenly the case just disappeared. Nobody knew how the case was withdrawn. Nigerians were not told. It was just done in secret. And our newspaper broke the story. that is a $6 billion federal suit against Pfizer disappeared secretly, that the Attorney General simply went into a secret day with Pfizer and a few Nigerian lawyers without anybody knowing about it. In fact, Pfizer may have violated the U.S. law because Pfizer refused to disclose the details of that settlement, even in its filing for the last quarter of 2009 to the U.S. government. So Nigerians are clearly outraged, and even the former Attorney General himself is threatening that he might sue Pfizer for blackmailing him. But in any case, the Attorney General himself is known to be terribly corrupt. So a lot of people are not surprised because he's known to be a corrupt man. He cannot enter the United States because the U.S. government has barred him, has withdrawn his visa and that of his family because he's known to be corrupt. But a lot of people are outraged that Pfizer could go to that extent to hire investigators or to blackmail a Nigerian official.
And initially, when the reports of this failed trial came out, what was the reaction in Nigeria and of the press and the government at the time?
Yeah, as Joe said, you know, Nigerians didn't know because it was just for a brief period. Pfizer just went in, you know, briefly, and there was so much confusion in Nigeria. Nigeria needed help. There was this epidemic. The country just needed help from wherever, you know, and Pfizer came on humanitarian ground. Nigeria accepted, and at the time we had military dictatorship. Things were so bad. There was no order in the country. There was no proper procedures were never followed in most of the things that happened at the time. So really at the time, Nigerians were grateful to Pfizer, and we never knew until it broke out in the press several years later, and Nigerians were really, really outraged.
Musikulu Mojid, I want to thank you for being with us. And finally, Joe Stevens, the WikiLeaks document, 10 seconds. What did you learn from what the U.S. diplomatic cable said about Pfizer in Nigeria?
Well, obviously, the allegations that something that sounds dangerously close to blackmail is being discussed, that's shocking. But also shocking is that Pfizer felt comfortable telling this to a State Department official, and it went back to Washington in a cable from the ambassador. And there's nothing critical in this report, which makes you wonder what the official U.S. government position was on these activities that were taking place.
Well, thank you as well. Joe Stevens, staff writer at the Washington Post, will link to your stories now, as well as the investigative series in 2000, the first of which began by the time word of the little girl's death reached the United States. Her name had been replaced by numerals, number 65870069. She was 10 years old and a scant 41 pounds. She lived in Nigeria, and in April 1996, she ached with meningitis. Going down a couple paragraphs, doctors working with Pfizer drew spinal fluid from the girl, gauged her symptoms, logged her as patient number 0069, a testing site number 6587, and experiment number 154149. They gave her 56 milligrams of Trovan. A day later, the girl's strength was evaporating. Pfizer records show in one of her eyes froze in place. On the third day, she died. Pfizer records are explicit. Action taken, dose continued unchanged. Outcome, death. Nobody can know for certain if the girl would have lived had she been taken off experimental Trovan. Perhaps she was beyond all hope. Yet the circumstances of her death, while taking an unapproved drug with alternate treatments at hand and a hurriedly established private sector experiment, suggests much larger problems. That's the beginning of the many-part series that the Washington Post did in 2000 that is now being revealed in these WikiLeaks documents.